on the origin of species. So Darwin formulated his theory of evolution in 1844, but continued to gather evidence to test his theory to see if what he thought was happening was actually happening. However, as he was working on gathering evidence and then writing better ways to explain it, Alfred Russel Wallace sent Darwin a letter basically coming up with the idea exactly the same as Darwin's, who had yet to publish his theory. And in science, it's all about who publishes first, so this got Darwin going and saying, okay, I better stop thinking about this and actually start publishing. So the two of them jointly published their findings in 1858, and then later Darwin published his entire work on all of the ideas and evidence for that theory in 1859, and that was called The Origin of Species. But originally, the theory of evolution due to natural selection is published for both Darwin as well as Wallace. So let's talk a little bit about what a theory means. So remember, the word theory is used differently in everyday language versus scientific language. So generally in everyday language, people would call a theory a guess. Now in science, that is not what we mean. In science, a theory means an explanation. So we're actually explaining how something happens, why it happens. There's a lot that goes into a scientific theory versus an everyday theory. In science, if you want to talk about guessing, essentially, at least a guess that you can test, we have a word for that we call hypothesis. So in science, a theory is not a guess, it is an explanation. It's the sum of everything we know. So let's take a look at a couple of the observations that Darwin and Wallace were looking at when they came up with their theory of evolution due to natural selection. So first thing is that population produce more offspring than there are adults. Second thing is that populations don't grow exponentially indefinitely. So you think if you're making more offspring, you'd have exponential growth in the population, but that's not what happens. So for example, field mice are really good at reproducing. They can have 6 pups or more. They can reproduce every 6 weeks. They reach sexual maturity somewhere around the age of 6 weeks old, and then they can, so within 6 months, a population of only 20 of them could reach 5,000 in number. So looking at this reproductive success of these mice, why haven't they taken over the world? Why don't we have this exponential growth indefinitely of mice? And so here's a couple more observations to explain that. First is that food and resources in general are going to be limited to some extent. And the populations that we're talking about, there is variation among them. So within a generation, not all of the individuals within that generation are going to be the same. There is variation among the populations. And those variations are heritable. They can be inherited by the next generation. So if a variable population with some individuals surviving and other ones not, who is it going to be that survives? That's what Darwin and Wallace were thinking about. And based on that, what effect would this have on the next generation? So you have a population where not all of them are going to survive. There is variation within the population. Who is it that's going to survive, and what will the effects be? Looking at that, they came up with the theory of evolution by natural selection, which essentially can be summarized by this sentence. Over generations, populations change as heritable characteristics that provide an advantage become more common. That's it. That's evolution. Now, often this is referred to as survival of the fittest, but really it's referring to reproductive success, so probably better to describe it as survival as the most reproductively successful. But again, all evolution is saying, all the theory of evolution says, in summary, is that over generations, populations change as the heritable characteristics that provide an advantage become more common. So here is a quick summary of that statement of the theory of evolution in 3 pictures, so it's really, really easy to understand. This is by University of California. So if we take a look at this population of beetles here, there is some variation amongst the population. Some beetles are orange, some beetles are green. So that is the variation among the population. And the natural selection part This is that these beetles, this population, is going to be exposed to some pressures within their environment. So these crows up here like to eat the beetles. And as you can tell from what they're saying, is they particularly like the green beetles. So they're going to be eating the green beetles. There's variation within the population, and some of them are not going to survive. So as the crows eat the green beetles, over generations, as these beetles are reproducing, there's going to be fewer green beetles because they get eaten, and more orange beetles. So that variation within the population, there is a certain advantage to the orange beetles because the green ones get eaten. So if you have variation within a population, and that variation provides an advantage, then the population will change over time. And over many generations, you end up with a completely different population than what you started with. Because there was variation within the population, that variation provided an advantage for some of those beetles to pass down that trait to the next generation, and over many generations, that changes the population. That's evolution. So, as a theory goes, is this a good theory? Let's evaluate the theory. In science, it's important to be critical of any of the ideas we have. So if it is a good theory, it needs to make sure it does actually explain what's going on. It should also be predictive. So really good theories not only state and explain what's happening, but they should be able to predict what will happen. And last, all science has to be testable or falsifiable. And so is this theory being tested? Can it be tested? Is it falsifiable? First off, explanatory. Can it explain things? So one of the classic examples of the many thousands of examples Darwin looked at is the finches that he saw on the Galapagos Islands. And so when he got there, he took a look at all these finches. They're kind of similar, but they are all different types. So there's some that eat insects, some that eat seeds and whatnot. And so let's look at the ones that eat seeds. There's 4 different types mentioned here, and they have different beak size, different sizes to their beaks. Some have small beaks, some have large beaks. They all eat seeds. Why would that be? What is the explanation for that? So 14 species on the Galapagos Islands. They all vary in their beak size. Why? Does the theory of evolution explain why that is? And since there is variability within a population, some birds are going to be born with different sized bills. Some will be smaller, some will be larger beaks. There's different seeds for them to eat. So if you have a larger beak, you might be able to eat larger seeds or crack open larger seeds than the rest of the birds around. So that variation of having a larger bill can provide an advantage to being able to eat larger seeds. And then this would make those birds with the larger beaks more successful because they can get to the seeds that other birds can't. So they will have an advantage over those other birds. Second thing, is it predictive? Does this theory actually tell us not only what and explain what is happening, but can it say what will happen? So things like antibiotics. We know that if you get prescribed antibiotics, you have to continue the whole treatment of antibiotics. You can't stop halfway through when you're feeling better, but you want to make sure you continue it right to the end. And the reason being is because the bacteria that you're fighting can become resistant to the antibiotic. And we had this theory of evolution before we had antibiotics, but knowing that generations will have variations or populations will have variations, and those variations can provide advantages to them, we know that if you have a bunch of bacteria in you, some of them are going to be killed by antibiotics and some of them may not be because of the variation, and those that are not will pass on that trait to the next generation, and therefore over many generations of the bacteria they can become resistant to the antibiotics. That can be explained and predicted with the theory of evolution. Pesticide, the same thing. If you have insects you're trying to kill, a pesticide might kill them, but we know if you continue to use the same pesticide on the same insects, over time the variation within the population of insects will provide resistance to the pesticide. No individual will have it, but over time, if one has slight resistance to the pesticide, it can pass on that trait to the next generation, and then in future generations there will be more of the insects that have more resistance to the pesticides. Another interesting thing among many different predictions, this one particularly from Darwin, was he was able to, before we actually had all of the fossils that we now have discovered, he knew that looking at our primitive or oldest human ancestors, he knew, based on the distribution of the apes, where those human ancestors would be found. And looking at the distribution of the apes, he was able to predict that we should be able to find more of our great ancestors in Africa than anywhere else in the world. And as it has turned out, that is correct. Third, is it testable and falsifiable? So the theory of evolution is tested every single time we come up with any data that has to do with biology at all. Every observation in biology is going to be a test of the theory of evolution. So think about this. That means every genome we sequence, every species we discover, every single one of them tests the theory of evolution. And it could falsify the theory. For example, if we discovered that there were a herd of unicorns living somewhere, that would falsify the theory of evolution, because there's no way to explain how a horse would get wings all of a sudden out of nowhere, or a horn, using the theory of evolution. We don't find that, and the fact that we've never found a winged horse is another confirmation of the theory of evolution. So every new piece in biology, every bit of evidence could potentially falsify the theory of evolution. However, since we've come up with a theory, and every bit of evidence we've had in biology has confirmed, strengthened, and we're looking at the general theory of evolution, the details have been modified and strengthened based on evidence. It all works with the theory of evolution. Again, it is a scientific theory, so it has changed over time. The basics, the stuff we're talking about today, has remained the same. So far, no real evidence has suggested anything to disprove the theory of evolution. Anything could. So if you found a human footprint and a dinosaur footprint together, that would falsify the theory of evolution. So it could be done. It is a theory, a scientific theory. It has to be falsifiable. However, we've never found anything like that. If we were to find that humans and dinosaurs existed at the same time, we could no longer use the theory of evolution. What's amazing is that every bit of evidence we've ever found regarding life confirms and strengthens the theory of evolution. So, in summary, Darwin's theory of evolution due to natural selection can be summarized in 5 basic points. More offspring are produced than survive. Populations have variations to them, and some of those variations due to the conditions that they're in are going to be favorable. Like being an orange beetle, if the birds around you like to eat green beetles, that is a variation that is favorable. Because of that, those that survive are going to be the ones that have favorable traits. And as we saw with the beetles, what this does is it causes the population to change over time. That's what evolution is. I'll leave you with this. Nothing in biology makes sense except in the light of evolution. So anything you look at in biology, something as complicated as cellular respiration, or you look at DNA replication, or whatever it is, an elephant's trunk, it doesn't make sense unless you think about how it arose. And that is the theory of evolution. If you look at the complications involved in the metabolism of glucose, all the steps involved, it doesn't really make sense that it would go in that way, except for if that trait or those characteristics were adapted and developed through descent with modification, the theory of evolution.